Imagine a world holding its breath, a planet divided, teetering on the brink of annihilation for nearly half a century. This wasn't a war fought with soldiers in trenches, but with spies in the shadows, scientists in labs, and politicians in high-stakes standoffs. This was the Cold War, the epic ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that shaped the modern world. So, how did we get here? And how did we survive? Our story begins in the smoldering ruins of World War II. The once allied USA and USSR emerged as the world's two superpowers, but their alliance quickly fractured. The United States championed democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, sought to expand its sphere of communist influence. In 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the free West from the Soviet-controlled East. The battle lines were drawn. The first major flashpoint was Germany. The country was carved up by the victorious Allies, with the capital, Berlin, lying deep inside the Soviet zone. In 1948, Stalin tried to starve West Berlin into submission by blockading all land routes. In a monumental show of resolve, the Western powers responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in supplies for nearly a year. It was a victory for the West, but it cemented the division of Germany and Europe. This led to the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance to counter Soviet aggression, followed by the Soviets' own Warsaw Pact. The chessboard was set. The tension wasn't just in Europe. In 1949, two seismic events shook the world. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. The arms race had begun. Second, Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in China's civil war, creating another massive communist power. The domino theory took hold in Washington, the fear that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow. This fear led to direct conflict in Korea. In 1950, Soviet-backed North Korea invaded US-backed South Korea. The United Nations, led by the United States, intervened. The war raged for 3 brutal years, seesawing up and down the peninsula, and even brought Chinese forces into the fight. It ended in a stalemate, with the Korean peninsula divided at the 38th parallel, a division that persists to this day. The Cold War had turned hot, costing millions of lives. The 1950s were a decade of paranoia and proxy wars. At home, the Red Scare and McCarthyism saw Americans hunting for communist infiltrators. Abroad, the CIA and KGB, the respective intelligence agencies, played a dangerous game of espionage, coups, and covert operations from Iran to Guatemala. Meanwhile, the space race kicked off in 1957 when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was a huge propaganda victory and sparked a frantic effort by the US to catch up, leading to the creation of NASA. The heavens themselves had become a new battlefield for superpower supremacy. The world came closer to nuclear Armageddon than ever before in October 1962. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, in response to US missiles in Turkey. When American spy planes discovered the sites, President John F. Kennedy initiated a naval quarantine of the island. For 13 terrifying days, the world watched as the two leaders engaged in a nerve-wracking standoff. A single miscalculation could have meant global catastrophe. Thankfully, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove the US missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a sobering wake-up call, leading to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline to prevent future miscommunications. After Cuba, the next major proxy war was Vietnam. What began as a nationalist struggle against French colonial rule evolved into a brutal conflict between the communist North and the US-backed South. America's involvement deepened throughout the 1960s, believing it was crucial to contain communism. The war dragged on for years, televised for the first time, bringing its horror into living rooms and fueling a massive anti-war movement in the United States. Despite deploying over 500,000 troops and immense firepower, the US couldn't secure victory. In 1975, Saigon fell, and Vietnam was unified under communist rule. It was a devastating and divisive experience for America, and a tragic one for the people of Vietnam. The late 1960s and 1970s saw a period of détente, a relaxation of tensions. Leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev sought to manage the rivalry through diplomacy and arms control. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT treaties, were signed, placing limits on nuclear arsenals. It seemed, for a moment, that the rivals could coexist. However, this fragile peace was shattered in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a friendly communist government. The USCA, seeing this as naked aggression, responded by funding and arming the Afghan resistance fighters. This became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a long, costly, and unwinnable war that drained its resources and morale. The 1980s saw a re-escalation of the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan took a hardline stance, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. He initiated a massive military buildup, including the controversial Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed space-based missile defense system. This renewed arms race put immense economic pressure on the already struggling Soviet economy. But inside the Soviet Union, change was coming. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He was a new kind of Soviet leader. Recognizing the deep economic and social problems plaguing his country, he introduced radical reforms, glasnost, meaning openness, which allowed for more freedom of speech and criticism of the government, and perestroika, a restructuring of the economy. Gorbachev also sought to end the costly arms race and improve relations with the West. The effects were revolutionary. Across Eastern Europe, people long oppressed by Soviet rule saw an opportunity. In 1989, a tidal wave of peaceful revolutions swept across the bloc. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, one by one, the communist regimes crumbled. The most symbolic moment came on November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War division, was breached. People from East and West Berlin celebrated together in a scene of pure joy, broadcast around the world. The Iron Curtain was gone. The collapse was swift. The Soviet Union itself began to disintegrate as its constituent republics declared independence. On Christmas Day 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. After 45 years of tension, proxy wars, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, the Cold War was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet dissolution of one of its main protagonists. The Cold War defined the second half of the 20th century. It created the world we live in today, from the alliances that shape our geopolitics to the technologies born from its intense competition. It was a story of fear and division, but also of resilience, of brave individuals who stood up for freedom, and of leaders who, at the most critical moments, chose diplomacy over destruction. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through one of history's most fascinating and perilous eras. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments what part of the Cold War you find most compelling. Until next time, stay curious.